Welcome to FOBtv, the future of business. I'm your host, Kevin Benedict, and I'm excited to be here. And I want to thank each of you for joining us today. Let me get right on it and introduce our guest today. His name is Suhas Uliyar. He's a good friend of mine. We've had this kind of cadence of once or twice a year, we catch up. What's new in the world of Oracle, especially in the area that Suhas is involved in. Matter of fact, he's the Vice President of Digital Assistant, AI, and Integration at Oracle. Thanks for joining us today, Suhas.
Hey, Kevin. Good to see you again, and thanks for having me as usual.
Absolutely. Now, before I go any further, let's just stop with your title again here. For those that may not be aware, what is the connection between a digital assistant, AI, and then integration? Like, why are those all together?
Great question, Kevin. So my title keeps growing. Actually, we're now adding process to it as well, which is good. But to answer your question, right? So the digital assistant is actually powered by AI. What's core to the digital assistant is the natural language processing, which is sort of the deep learning algorithms that we use to understand and interpret what the user is asking, whether it's sort of converting speech to text, text to speech, and of course, then taking that language and understanding what are they asking and doing something about it, right? So that's the first part of why the AI services, language, speech are part of sort of the overall direction with the digital assistant. The second part is, given that we have an enterprise focus, ultimately we got to go get data from a system of record, right? Whether that's Oracle or non-Oracle. So if you ask a question like, what's my vacation balance? I need to go to some HCM system, whether it's Oracle or Workday or SAP, and get that information. And so the Oracle Integration Cloud gives us the foundation for the digital integration hub that can be used. So you have your integration in one place, and then I can now leverage that to either build, remember the good old days, we used to build mobile apps. We needed to get APIs from the back ends. So the integration cloud provides this digital integration hub that I can use now to expose all my back-end interfaces through a very common way of consuming this, whether it's a digital assistant or a mobile application. And then hence sort of, this overall things sort of come in play. And as we talk about the future, we also want to talk about intelligent process and intelligent automation that sort of becomes part of my portfolio.
Wow. Yeah, I can start to understand how everything is going to need to be tied in.
Indeed.
Because just like the keyboard can gain access to all the various systems, when you're using those voices, you need to do that same thing, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah, with the digital assistants. So before we jump into kind of the meat of our interview today, let me just ask, has Oracle achieved artificial general intelligence yet?
Ooh, huh. All right. I'll sort of say not quite. And I think the whole industry is craving towards that. I think we're still in the narrow sort of AI path in general, right? And one theory is sort of based on a fear of a dystopian future where Terminator 2 comes live, right? And that's what, a little bit we're worried about. But to be honest, right, Kevin, we're not quite there where the machines can make conscious decisions with a full set of cognitive abilities, right? So here we are scratching the surface and trying to sort of ensure that we can automate a lot of the things that humans do, but we're still sort of not quite there in taking that exponential learning to the next level, right? When you talk about sort of general AI, it's all about strong AI, right? Uses sort of what I believe is the theory of mind AI framework, which is the ability to discern sort of emotions, beliefs, thought processes, or other intelligent entities that, it's hard for machines to replicate. So I would say, of course, a lot of research going on across the board, but no, we're not quite there. And it'll be interesting to see how fast we can get there.
Oh, yeah. But yeah, so let me just ask you, where are you on this scale? Is that scary or is that exciting to you?
Personally, it's exciting, right? And there are certain traces of it that we'll talk about in the way we're evolving the digital assistant to sort of have context, being able to do reasoning, but again, with sort of I would say a constrained set of rules, if you like, a constrained set of data sets. So it's exciting for me. I mean, is it scary? No, as a technologist, for me, it's exciting. But if it gets in the wrong hands, certainly it could be scary.
I know, when you're involved in the actual development yourself, often you're far less afraid, I think, because your code doesn't do magical stuff.
Exactly. But I'll tell you what worries me. I'll tell you what worries me the most, and it's probably something we'll talk about it later on. But it's getting the right set of data, because ultimately that is, I've been saying this for quite a while, that data is the new programming language. It's not really about creating the models and fine-tuning the models. It's the data that actually does this. And it's very fascinating. My daughter just did a AI course with Stanford in general to learn AI, and her project was criminal justice. And it's amazing how much the data skews how we think, which as a result, the machine thinks. So that is what scares me the most. What scares me is, can we get the right data?
Yes. Oh, wow. So last time you and I were talking together, we were talking about kind of the evolution of chatbots and digital assistants and what they are now, next capable of doing. Why don't you update us? It's been probably close to a year now. So give us an update on kind of what's exciting on your plate there at Oracle.
Yeah. So the digital assistant has essentially become sort of the engagement channel, if you like, for Oracle apps and also for non-Oracle apps. So we've seen a significant adoption given, as a result of COVID, with folks working from home and the increased burden on enterprises to support their customers, whether they're internal customers or external customers. The digital assistant has really stepped up, and we've seen a significant functional and technology innovation in natural language processing with deep learning and all the really cool stuff with transformers and transfer learning capabilities. So we've certainly sort of raised the bar in the way we can truly understand, interpret, and respond to users' inquiries. Done some really cool stuff there. And not only that, but given Oracle, so as you know, Kevin, I focus on the platform and the development tools aspect of things. But what's really exciting is that this has been adopted by all the Oracle applications and the global business units that are focused from a vertical perspective. So they're building out of the box bots, what we refer to as skills. And so we're seeing a significant adoption in our customer base and seeing this sort of shift happening from what we now refer to the old way of doing things called the old HTML to now using conversations to interact with applications. So that's being able to see customers, users interact with this has really sort of been exciting for me.
Wow, that's brilliant. When I think of all these applications of digital assistants and chatbots, it seems like a lot of them have fairly narrow focus in the different applications and different capabilities. Is there a notion of layers of AI where you might have a whole set of AI applications and then an AI manager over top of that? How does that happen?
It's a great question, Kevin. So I'll sort of give two answers to it. So I'm seeing this happen from the consumer perspective. So for example, there are a lot of these, robotic sort of vacuum cleaners, right? The iRobot and so on and so forth, right? And what we're beginning to see is while they have embedded AI to figure out how to clean stuff, it's augmented by some other component. For example, a drone that has its own AI that can use its intelligence married with this intelligence to make a much more valuable decision, right? So we're seeing, and definitely not in the enterprise space, but we're seeing this happen in the consumer space, where units of intelligence are beginning to interact with other units of intelligence to create sort of more higher levels of smartness, if you like, right? So to take a page out of that, there is one area that we are actually focusing on. And this sort of talks, in a way, sort of gets us to a point of where are we going beyond the digital assistant, right? So today, the digital assistant is primarily about responding in a very smart way to natural inquiries that you get, natural language inquiries, right? Whether that's FAQ based or transactional based, or whether it's sort of inbound to or employee based or external facing, right? So one area where we're headed to is the concept of moving this bot we refer to as skill into a digital worker, right? And the digital worker basically encompasses all the knowledge to actually perform an action on behalf of the user, right? So think about it from a perspective of, let's say that I'm a manager and I've got folks working for me, and today I get a lot of approval notices. So the digital assistant can look at my behavior. I can teach it certain things that I want it to do. No different to what I would tell my admin to do, human to do. I would basically tell the digital assistant, hey, you know what? If Kevin actually submits an approval, if it's below $2,000, I know that Kevin's a great guy. I know he's trustworthy. Go ahead and approve it on my behalf, as long as it meets the corporate policies, right? Now, so you have these different units of work. So one area where we are seeing this concept of AI manager to AI sort of components is the concept where I can, for example, tell a digital assistant, hey, I want to hire an AI expert for vision. Go do what you have to do that. And it's able to take that, break down that sentence into a bunch of different processes. And each of these processes can be assigned to a different digital worker, and it can orchestrate this process on behalf of me, right? Really? So that is one area that we are beginning to see where we can have this concept of an AI manager that is orchestrating processes that other AI components that know its subject matter expertise can interact, know its boundaries, and can talk to each other.
That is exciting.
Yeah.
Because I can imagine you have those AI workers, and you have AI managers, and then maybe AI executives and AI CFO and
AI big brother.
And then you have AI customers. Oh my, what a world that we live in here.
I know.
So in preparation for this particular session, you told me that your digital assistant is kind of going in multiple directions. One is becoming even more personal to individuals, while at the same time it's becoming more effective and more broad across the enterprise. Why don't you share with us, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so going back to what I mentioned earlier, right? So the digital assistant, for most part, I mean, look at chatbots, virtual assistants, call it what you may. Today, its primary focus is to take an utterance or a question or a statement that an end user asks, understand that, and give you a response. So that's sort of pretty much what most of the chatbots, virtual assistant, digital assistants in the industry do today. Slightly tangential to your question, if you look at sort of where there is a lot of investment going on, if you look at sort of where Gartner, Forrester, IDC talk about sort of the next big thing that's happening is this term called hyper automation, right? I think IDC calls it intelligent automation, Forrester's called it digital automation. But basically, the bottom line is to be able to automate anything and everything that can be automated. And so when we talk about automation, primarily what is it? It is that to automate what humans are actually doing and where humans are in the loop. So what we're looking at is, are there ways where we can learn and we can automate a lot of these processes? I mean, today, process automation primarily is defined as RPA, robotic process automation, right? But what RPA is truly doing is it's automating what is already there, right? So essentially, you take a process. If it's a human clicking 5 things, I got an email, I clicked on the email, I downloaded this, I took this field, I copy pasted it, I put it into SAP. That human process is being automated by recording and replaying that, right? So either in an attended mode, unattended mode. But it's pretty much sort of automating a process that's already predefined without any intelligence to it, right? You can get to the next level of intelligence where, for instance, at Oracle now, the way to do expenses is you take a picture of your expense, you upload it to the digital assistant. We then use document processing to use OCR to extract the information from the expense, be able to then apply language processing to understand, oh, here is a merchant name, here's a date, here's a tip amount, here's a total amount, and so on and so forth, and then be able to then apply that using integration to the backend systems. So that takes you to the next level of automation. What we're thinking is even go beyond that, where either the human is teaching or asking the digital assistant to watch for certain things. So for example, we can say, hey, can you watch out and let me know if my budget is going to exceed 60% in the first month of the quarter itself, right? And or ask any question. So for example, let's say there's a situation, right? So you and I are working for a company, there's a situation. What do? We get on a Zoom call like we're doing right now. We discuss things and we try to find out like, why did something happen? But imagine a situation where the digital assistant was part of this conversation and we said, hey, digital assistant, can you find out when did we close this deal? Can you tell me which companies or vendors did we compete with? Why did we actually win this deal? And actually, hey, can you take some action items for me? Can you remind me to send this document to this customer tomorrow morning? Can you do a follow-up and let me know if the customer has actually responded to my email? So in a sense, the digital assistant truly becomes an assistant where it can actually learn from you. It can watch. It can plan for you and start basically taking action on your behalf. So that is where truly for every employee in an organization, you can actually have an admin that can truly be beneficial for the employee. So that is sort of the exciting part of where we're evolving the digital assistant to truly sort of take the word assistant and learn and be able to perform actions on behalf of the user.
Wow, that is exciting. I was reading this morning and doing research on the concept of ambient computing.
Indeed.
And that's what this sounds like, right?
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
the digital assistant is just always back there listening in.
Yeah.
And you can just run off reminders and schedules and, all these kinds of things. And it's just happening behind the scenes.
Yeah.
Another concept that's just interesting, or not concept, just a kind of a trend, is a lack of productivity growth over the past decade or few decades.
Mm-hmm.
This to me seems like a very effective way of improving productivity.
Absolutely, Kevin.
Right back here in my library is a book about John Boyd.
Oh yes, Mr. Boyd, the Oda guru.
But yes, the observe, orient, decide, and act. Yeah, so he taught, he was one of the premier military strategists of the 21st century. From about 1980 through 2000, he was one of the most premier military strategists there was. He came up with all kinds of unique and still used concepts for maneuver warfare, for pilots to be able to think through huge, complex kind of formulas and instant action. And how do you respond when you're under attack? Mm-hmm. And he created all these concepts and strategies for how to just, in an arena that requires agility, how do you think through that instantly?
Indeed.
So when Suhas, when you and I were talking here before we started recording, you said UDA with the addition of L
UDA
has now become, kind of core to some of the things you're doing. Talk to us about that.
Yeah. So going back to sort of, and it's every question you've asked, Kevin, sort of ties down to this common thing about, how do you automate processes, right? And in order to automate processes, what do you want to do? First of all, you want to observe what's going on, right? You want to orient yourself to that process that has happened. You want to be able to then say, okay, now that I have observed and oriented, what do I know about this that I can actually now act on it? In order to act, you have to sort of decide what are the steps I can do, right? And that sort of brings us to sort of the UDA framework. But then as a result of the data they've collected, and this is where machine learning comes in, that I can now learn either through things like reinforcement learning. So for instance, let's say I did something and I noticed that the user did sort of say, yeah, you did it right. Or perhaps said, no, actually, that's not what I meant. Here's sort of what I expected you to do, right? So being able to learn from that and then sort of change your model. So when you now go back to your decide and act, you have this as an input, right? So when you look at the ODA loop, the learn aspect is now, something perhaps is inherent in that, but because of machine learning, we want to be able to look at the outcomes and then be able to sort of say, okay, can I reinforce the learnings so the machine learning algorithms can learn and decide that what it did was right or wrong. Right?
Oh, brilliant.
Right. Now, so how does it break it, right? So back to the earlier point I made about RPA, right? RPA basically is recording what a user is doing, okay? But there are much more different techniques in the way we can recognize, or what we call discover, how processes actually work in an enterprise, right? So it's called process discovery, process mining, task discovery, task mining. So we can start looking at, how do users actually interact? How do systems interact with each other through log files, through change data capture? So we can look at sort of, okay, when someone placed an order, what really happened to the system? What were the inefficiencies in the system? Why did it take so long? And also be able to sort of say, every company starts with, here's our ideal process execution. But then what happens is there are deviation and exceptions all along the way. Why did those things happen, right? So first is to be able to, again, get the knowledge, which is sort of the observe, right? And then understand sort of why those things are happening. Then be able to apply that and sort of say, okay, here are some decisions I want to make. So for example, let's say I have a meeting with a customer and I say, hey, I'm going to meet Kevin before the meeting. Can you suggest a Starbucks close to a mile to that customer? Now, perhaps there is no Starbucks. I mean, a digital assistant might turn around and say, sorry, cannot help you. There is no Starbucks within a mile, which is probably not true, but for discussion's sake, let's say that that's not true. But where the reasoning comes in to say, I may not have a Starbucks, but here are a couple of the restaurants within a mile where you could meet Kevin before you meet the customer.
That have 4-star Yelp rating.
Exactly. Yeah, you can add all those, but that's sort of where, the decide and act component comes in. And then if I say, yeah, that's okay, but I don't want to go to a restaurant, I just want to go to coffee, then that's where the reinforcement learning comes in to say, okay, he wants to, and Suhas and Kevin do want to have coffee and not have a meal, right? So sort of that is sort of where the UDA framework really sort of fits really well into the whole aspect of intelligent automation, which is sort of the next big thing that, where the digital assistant is going.
No, thank you for sharing that with us. As I'm thinking about all these advances that you guys are developing there at Oracle around digital assistants, and I'm thinking that the more you grant digital assistants access to various enterprise systems, that's going to present its own set of security challenges. Talk to us about how kind of that environment.
Oh, yeah. So this was one thing, Kevin, it's a great point that you bring up. There was one thing fundamentally we thought about as we sort of started building the digital assistant back in sort of 2016, 2017, is, let's take a very simple use case, right? Today's digital assistant, and I give it to an employee, I can check on my last pay, right? Hey, when did I get paid? And how much did I get paid, right? What if I ask, hey, can you tell me how much did Kevin get paid? The digital assistant doesn't care. It's like, okay, I'll go get the answer, right? So, and so obviously, being able to sort of leverage the pre-existing authorization rules, the authentication authorization rules, and the data security policies are very critical. So this is sort of what differentiates an enterprise grade versus sort of a chatbot that you basically use for customer service, right? And this is, so we have from the ground up sort of built that into account where we are integrated with sort of the policy management tools, with the security management tools. We know sort of the boundaries of what you can and cannot see, also what you can and cannot store. So GDPR and any PII information. So that is absolutely fundamental and critical to sort of the overall execution to make sure that you're defining sort of the boundaries. No different to like when we used to build mobile apps, right? I mean, if you could only access what you are allowed to access because you're leveraging those APIs and the policies around those APIs. So those are very critical aspects of the platform.
Understood. Hey, so how much do you guys try to personalize your digital assistants? I mean, do you create an avatar? Do you give them a different accent that you can choose from, male or female and all those? How do you guys approach that?
Yeah, so the personality of the digital assistant is very critical. So we love to see this. So a lot of our customers, the marketing teams get involved, especially when it is external customer facing. Now, even internal customer facing, we do see a lot of customers wanting to have their own little avatars, their icons, and the personality also in the way it responds. And, we always love to sort of get that, hey, what did you call your digital assistant? We call it XYZ, some wonderful, right? So we are definitely seeing that a lot happen and give it some personality. But in terms of sort of voice base, today, we are sort of offering sort of our brand, but the idea is that, as we are getting more into sort of deep neural nets for what we call text to speech, right? So the opposite of taking speech and converting it to text, which is called TTS, text to speech. That's sort of where we are going to be allowing our customers to have their own actors, their own sort of accents, their own voice, their own sort of brand, if you like. No different to how people wanted a different color for their websites. We're going to enable that sort of text to speech and make it easy for customers to sort of add their branding. So that's something in the future in the roadmap that we have. But personalization definitely is on top. And today our focus is mainly on like how you respond and and the kind of the sort of the personality in terms of the avatar and the icons that you have is where we are today.
Oh, fun. Yeah, I can imagine that, just getting it to work is step one.
Yes.
And then number two, let's make it beautiful or something.
Indeed.
So how far away, Suhas, are we from things like empathy, understanding humor, being snarky, the whole, how far away are we from digital assistants actually understanding that?
You know what? We're not that far away from I don't want to use the word utopia, but getting there, right? So today we do sentiment analysis, aspect-based sentiment analysis, which is a pretty cool thing. So what that means, Kevin, is let's say that you were asked to give your feedback on a recent purchase that you did, or perhaps you went to a restaurant and you wanted to get some feedback, right? So what you could say is, hey, we went to the restaurant. The wait time was way too long, but the food was awesome. But the waiter could have done a better job, right? So what you have is you have one negative sentiment, one positive sentiment, and one sort of closer to a negative sentiment, right? Mm-hmm. So we're able to do this aspect based, and there's enough sort of data now where we can understand, anger, being upset, understand swear words, and so we're able to sort of take all that and discern what to do with it, right? But at the rate at which sort of these languages are, or the sort of spoken languages are changing, it is a little bit difficult. So for example, someone says, "This is the dog," right? Now, what does that mean? Does it mean like a positive sentiment or a negative sentiment? Right? So that's sort of where we're still trying to. That's sort of like the snarkiness that you mentioned as well. Yeah. It's interesting that there are companies that are focused on creating these data sets that actually help us understand. So as I mentioned earlier, data is a new programming language, but from a pure technology perspective, we are there. Now what we need is the data for it to learn about what to do with it, or to be able to recognize it better.
I think a lot of big companies, especially I think here at TCS, when COVID came, they showed a lot of empathy and caring for their employees. I mean, every day it's, basically the message is, we want to care for you and your family and your children. Here's the things that we can do to help, so there's really a empathetic and just a real sincere message, because they knew it was a big struggle for all their employees. So the whole tone of kind of the communication with their employees changed almost overnight and has persisted throughout the last year. And absolutely. I think that's really good, but it shows that there was humans behind that were listening to kind of the struggles of the families going through a global pandemic. That's why I was asking that same question there, how far away are we from digital assistants really almost across the company, where they can start understanding the tone and how employees are feeling, and maybe the company should change their messaging even, and their approach, and provide some additional services, because kind of uniformly across the whole organization, this is the tone.
Yeah, and that certainly is something that is there today, and Obviously, in order to understand the initial sort of teething pains are to understand the situation, if you like. But once you have that data, so for example, being able to take that conversation that has happened between two humans, sharing that empathy, sharing sort of how to do things and checking on them. Once we have that sort of base data, it's very easy to train. So when someone sort of says, hey, I have this problem, it's able to respond with that same level of empathy. It feels like that's something that you're not helping with. The most important aspect that we always preach is to then hand it over to a human.
Yeah.
Don't try to be human. Be very clear of what your role is and what you do is to sort of try and help. But at some point, always hand it to a human, because ultimately that's sort of where the problem is going to be resolved.
So talking about those limits and kind of when you hand off, where is AI today? Where is that front line, that leading edge of where AI is today? And what are those major obstacles and hurdles that are holding AI back?
I come down to sort of the same thing, right? That we don't have all the data for us to make those informed decisions, right? That just isn't enough data, right? So in lieu of that, it's sort of the way we talk to our customers to say, if we can automate 70-80% of your truly, I don't want to use the word mundane, but more repeatable sort of questions, your tasks, and leave sort of the complex ones for a human to answer or respond or fix. And we'll learn from that. So that is the path we're taking. And I would say that it's probably going to be maybe another 5 years or so before we get to a point where everyone truly understands the value of data, and not only sort of just get the data, but getting the right data, the right labeled data, where the machine can really truly start taking on more and more, right? So it's sort of inch by inch, it continues to improve. But as I said, it's not necessarily the base algorithms. They continue to improve. The set of GPUs or the processing capability continues to improve. Capacity continues to improve. It's really truly having the right data, understanding the right labeling of the data and when to use it, as being able to understand that as a sort of a barrier, and is working towards fixing that.
Oh yeah, that's one of the big kind of aha moments when I was, first starting rolling up my sleeves and getting into AI, is the recognition that it's not the algorithm. The algorithm's empty. It doesn't generate anything unless there's data flowing through it. And then it can kind of it looks at the data and it can make some decisions. But the whole learning part is exercise of huge volumes of data, right? That's a cat.
Yeah.
In the photo, I've seen 3 million cat photos. Now I know what a cat looks like.
That is, yeah.
So, I mean, there has to be those massive volumes of data, and the data, as you pointed out, has to be labeled so you know what to do with it.
Yeah.
The photos have to say that's a cat.
Indeed. But there are techniques that sort of are beginning to help with that, like transfer learning, where you can train your model on a certain set of data and use that knowledge, and as the word suggests, transfer it to a different model with some less tweaks. And there's things like out of domain handling and sort of managing imbalance of data. For example, one of the things that we do is, while we train our models on a ton of data that we have, when we go to a customer, they probably have 1/10 of our data, and the last thing we want to do is train on that 1/10 of the data but make decisions based on the 9/10 of the data that we provide, right? So we understand sort of those nuances and the differences, and that's what makes AI hard when you look at this imbalance to make the right decision based on that imbalance and bias.
So talk to me about, if we look 3 years in the future there, Suhas, what are the kinds of technologies that you're just very eager to see in production?
Reasoning, the fruition of the digital worker, and being able to sort of, watch and learn. It's no different to sort of seeing a kid grow up, right? Watching and learning the good behaviors and bad behaviors, and then being able to discern between what's good and bad. So I think, I'm looking forward to sort of that. And I'm seeing sort of those inch by inch getting to that point. So one of the most exciting technologies that I can't wait for internally that we are developing is this concept called conversation to anything, right? So we call this a conversation to Oracle Machine Learning Representation Language. So con to OMLR, right?
Oh yeah, I got that one down.
You got that down, right? So the idea there is the following, right? That can I just tell the digital assistant an action, and that action either converts itself to going and getting me the answer. So for example, if I just have a normalized database, and without requiring any coding. So if you look at today's programming models for conversational AI, if you like, right? So what you do is you go and define an intent, you define utterance, you define entities, you map entities to utterances, blah, blah, blah. You train the model. And obviously then there's the integration part. Our view is, hey, can we just take a conversation and auto-generate the SQL, for example, if you have a SQL database where all your where all the data is, without having to do any program.
Instead of telling the AI system where to find it all, they know the logic of how they would go find it.
Exactly, right? And also sort of the system of record you go to. So for example, let's say that, for most part, let's say that it's time for me to do my performance review for my team, right?
Yes.
Typically I start with say, hey, what did Kevin do last year? What rating did Kevin get last year? In general, sort of how many of my team folks got a bonus last year, right? So I have a whole bunch of ad hoc questions that I may want to ask, and that may not be predetermined, right? Now, if you take all applications, today, unless you're at the SQL level, there is no UI in the world that's going to be able to answer every question that you can think of, right? And that is sort of where we're going, is if I can come up with a way to ask a question, especially if the backend schema set is let's say we start with a relational database.
Yeah.
Then I can discover the database, discover the relationships, take my conversation and auto-generate complex SQL queries to get my answer without any predetermined coding. That is one, right?
So nice.
Yeah. The other one we're working on is exactly the same thing. So for example, let's say that, I'm a salesperson and I want to send out a quote, right? So what I do is, let's say I say, hey, what would be a recommended quote for a deal like this? So let's say that, I have some parameters of the deal, like the deal size, the brand name of the company I'm selling to, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
So it can take that and say, you know what, to us, you are likely to get a 25% discount approval without any problems based on previous history, right? Yeah. Or previous deals. Now I say, okay, can you generate a quote for me with 25% with this discount and send it to my manager for approval? Now, you and I know that the first thing to do is to generate a quote. The next thing is to send to my manager. But how does the system know what comes first and what is dependent on what? Yeah. And so being able to use conversation to auto-generate a process and the sequence of processes with dependencies and sequences. So those are sort of some exciting things that I'm looking forward to, where that's sort of where the intelligent automation components come into play.
I like that auto-generation of processes.
And steps.
Yes. So this is where you start seeing, rather than having to very specifically define in code, you can start really seeing how AI could assist with an agile enterprise.
Exactly.
Couldn't you?
Yeah, exactly. A lot of the ad hocness that you have in the business.
Yeah, brilliant.
But ultimately, Kevin, what happens, right? There's a reason why people call each other, get on Zoom calls, and so on and so forth, is because they need to find someone who has that information that can help them in a situation.
Right.
And that's what we're trying to automate here.
I love it. Suhas, I want to thank you for taking time out of your very busy and innovative environment to spend time and educate the rest of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. It's a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for having me.